I'm live. Today is the January the 20th, 2025, and I'm reading A Vague Vacation. It is a travel book by Joan Marshall Grant. She was traveling in 1946 through France and a little bit of Switzerland. This is published 1947. It was dedicated to her dad, with love to my father, Marshall. He was a marshal. And I am here in chapter 32, Green Grow the Ruins. After a comfortable night in Moulins, we left in sunshine. 90 kilometers of N7 might have been interesting if we had been in a fast car, but although it was only 12 when we reached Pouilly-sur-Loire, we were ready for lunch. The only things I remember about the Relais Fleury were a blazing fire beside which we stood drinking pouilly fumé, and 3 professional cyclists, each flamboyant in a striped jersey and at least 2 massive rings. They had arrived in a car, but their jutting chests and knotted calves made the presence of handlebars and whirling pedals almost tangible. They reminded me of the road from Fontainebleau to Paris, when I had tried to drive against the flood of the 1938 championship. The 400 competitors were jockey silks, and each was followed by several carloads of enthusiastic supporters who shouted encouragement, waved bottles, and drove with complete disregard for traffic laws. Eventually I parked by the curb, for had one of the entrants collided with me, I was afraid that the crowd might have behaved as though I had been caught nobbling the favourite in the paddock of Epsom. To escape from the main road, we crossed the Loire, and were rewarded by Patvert, who brought us to Sancerre. It is built on a conical hill, and in a distance resembles Poitiers or Cours. Narrow street wind up between ancient houses to a terrace of plane trees and a wide view of the vineyards that produce the delicate wines which take their name from the town. We left regretfully and followed quiet roads beside a canal that loitered past exclamations of poplars and under wooden drawbridges which might have been painted by Van Gogh, until Chatillon beckoned us again into a side turning. In an alley so narrow that there was only space for the car, an orange kitten sat and disdained the sound of the horn. I gave it 2 or 3 minutes to finish its coiffure and then carried it to a doorstep. But as soon as I got back into the car, it returned to bar the way. This time I looked for someone who might take charge, and a very old woman told me that it belonged to her mother, who lived in a cottage by the gate of the chateau. Carrying the kitten, I knocked on a door, scintillated by scarlet dahlias. Surely it was a white witch who came out in the sunshine. She was very small, as though she belonged to a race of a finer structure, and under the starched cap her face had an extraordinary beauty. The wrinkles were only a patina, the grey eyes vital, the voice clear and unhesitant. Even her hearing was acute, though she must have been over 90. She told me that her great-grandson was head gardener at the chateau, and that its owner was a man whose goodness of heart made him the friend of everyone in the village. She suggested I call on Monsieur de Marquis, for he would like me, especially as I was English. But after we had turned in through the gate, we took a second drive, which led to another entrance at the foot of the hill, hoping that if anyone saw us, would think we had lost our way instead of our nerve. It was Patvert who made us stay the night in Gillian, though he let us think we chose it through the guide gastronomique, which gave such a good account of the hotel that we had already booked a room before we realized that it was obviously out of season. There was a private bath, but no hot water, and we were the only visitors. While Charles went in search of a garage which could repair the headlight, I went down to the river and tried to lose the despondency which had afflicted me as we crossed the bridge. What was wrong here? It must be more than the ordinary aftermath of bombs and shell fire, for we had seen other ruined towns. The evening was strangely quiet, the river smooth as steel, the sky impersonal. The quality of unreality increased. I deliberately walked down the bank and thrust my hands into the chilly water to try to make myself less receptive. Charles joined me and we sat on a bench watching the sun go down behind the plane. Gloomy, he said. Disappointed with the hotel? It was no use pretending any longer. Not ordinarily gloomy, but very disassociated. There's a job for us here, but I don't know what kind or which century. There is a notice in the hall appealing to the local people to rebuild the chateau, he said. Apparently, it's a national monument and used to bring tourists here. We'd better go there and have a sniff around before it gets too dark. Then added hopefully, perhaps it's only us. Perhaps it's only a sad little 18th century ghost who won't be too difficult. We passed the bridge and climbed long flights of broken steps between ruined houses to the chateau at the top of the cliff. There were masons working on one wing, but the doors stood open and it would have been easy enough to go through the deserted rooms without interruption. But I stood in the courtyard and said decisively, "There's nothing up here. At least, if there is, it's none of our business." We found another flight of worn steps, which led down beside the guardian wall of the chateau into a desolation. Cellars gaped like rifled tombs, and it was difficult to see where the streets had been, for everything was pounded into chaos. Bombs that might miss the bridge, I said. Shellfire, too uniform for bombing. We knew it must have been done early in the war, for several bushes of butlers had forced their way through cracks in the broken masonry. When the rabble had been cleared, a row of huts of the type given by the government to the bombed out made a row of 4 little shops. One was a buvette, selling only mineral water and beer. One was a mineral water and beer. We talked to the woman who owned it and through her personal story learned something of the recent history of Gillian. In 1940, she had been evacuated just before the Germans arrived. The French army had tried to hold the bridge from the west bank, so it was their own shellfire which had destroyed the part of the town which faced the river. She showed us her only pre-war possession, an ashtray advertising Perrier, which she had found under the debris which covered the side of her house. It survived again, she said. We were bombed out of our lodgings when the Americans removed the railway bridge. How did the Germans behave here during the occupation? She shrugged. We were luckier than some towns, for we were not sufficiently important to have the Gestapo. One must be fair to the Wehrmacht. Some of them were not unkind. My husband killed a police dog belonging to an officer. It had tried to bite him several times. He hit it on the head and it died next morning. There was an autopsy by a veterinary, all very correct. The penalty for killing a German dog was death. But no one betrayed my husband, not even 3 German soldiers who knew he was the man they wanted. She fetched us another glass of beer before she went on talking. During the war we had something for which to fight. One day the Germans would be driven out and we should be free. But life is more difficult now than it was before. Under the bush, we always got our rations. But now it is often impossible to buy them unless we pay the black market prices. She became animated. We've had 2 good harvests, but where has the grain gone? Why have we even less bread? Where's the wine? Why don't we get even the 2 liters a month we are allowed? Tell me, is it true that all our bread and our wine is in England? Yet again we explained our condition, and she was eager to believe what we said. They tried to make us hate England before, but this time we shall not be so stupid. I have taught my son not to believe our papers. This was just before the referendum of 13th of October, but though we had discussed the exact implications of the oui and non with many people, we were still uncertain what they entailed. We saw a oui poster on a farmyard wall over a hutch of white rabbits and stopped to read it. An old woman drudging along the dirty lane asked us to tell her what was written there. She was not illiterate. Her eyes were filmed with catarrh. It is an election poster, said Charles. I find it difficult to understand. I thought it might be something important. At an election, one does not need to be able to read to know what that means. There was an infinite scorn in her voice. It means nothing. It is only ink to cover lies. Why should I trouble myself to vote? All parties promise us more to eat and we are still hungry. All promise fuel and we are still cold. She chuckled and the sound was macabre. But France will survive. Even her own politicians cannot destroy her. We walked slowly back through the dusk. My depression increased, for I kept on hearing the voice of the woman in the buvette when she had said with a terrible resignation, my husband earns 340 francs each day, and each day it is impossible for 3 of us to eat for less than 1,000. In 2 months we shall have used all our savings. Then we must learn to be hungry. How can they create a future when they have lost faith in it? I said. They have been betrayed before and they won't believe they can stop it happening again. They must somehow recapture the valiant heart. Courage? Haven't they enough? Could you live among ruins and still keep on working day after day for nothing? Courage? Haven't they enough? Could you live among ruins and still keep on working day after day for nothing? Endurance is not enough. It sounds hideously smug, but you know, I don't mean it that way. Can a leader arise unless he is an expression of the will of the people? Forgive me, you know this better than I do, but if only they could get free of despair, they would see for themselves and demand what they deserve. Are you being a little intolerant? For I've seen you react pretty sharply to a haunted room. How would you like to live in a town like this? You've given me the clue, I said quickly. Now I know why we've come here. As usual, I had been obtuse. Charles maintains this is an attempt to escape the issue, which may be true, but if so, is remarkably silly, for it only makes the preliminaries more difficult. I'm less invulnerable than some people to what parapsychologists call extrasensory perception. The faculty used to be so tiresome when all I could do was to bleat that a room was affected, instead of being able to cope with the situation, that I had to relearn the technique which Charles acquired by slightly more orthodox means. It is idiotic to be deceived by size, I said. A haunted room in a haunted town, the area is not so very important, provided providing we extend ourselves. What have we got to tackle here? Fear, mass fear and hatred of dark authority. It is sometimes necessary to decontaminate a place before it is fit to live in. We can at least try to do something about it. I agree, said Charles. As a matter of interest, I got the same hunch about 5 minutes before we started to talk. This again was not at all unusual, and my feeling of melancholy had given way to the familiar sensation of being supercharged with vitality. We must be intelligently directed, or one might fuse like an electric lamp, which tried to carry more than its normal voltage. The room was rising while we climbed to the highest part of the town that was silent as the ruins of Pompeii, at least to us, who were both deliberately aware of more than three-dimensional conditions. As we came back, we heard music and saw lights reflected in the river. Their source was a small cafe in another we were invited to join. The Patron and his wife in the back room in warm lamplight, where a dance band on the radio provided the background to conversation. Madame wore a pink satin blouse and a black skirt. Her husband was comfortable in shirt sleeves. Charles took off his coat and loosened his tie, for within 5 minutes we were en famille. Certainly they had been bombed out, but what matter? Already their business prospered, and next year it would be even better. They had just returned from their first holiday in 7 years, a weekend in Paris. It was essential that we viewed the Folle Berger and the Bull Tabaran, specialities not to be missed. They sounded like children describing a pantomime. Yes, they had been here during the war, but the Germans had been very correct and always paid their bills. They had even been kind, for when the bombers came, Madame had been terrified, but 2 German boys had hurried her in the back of the house and lain on top of her to protect her from danger. This was obviously a family joke, for her husband grinned and said fondly, "She is a frank one. When she's frightened, she lets everyone know." I, of course, did not run, for I saw the planes were English, so I stood and watched them piquer the bridge. It was beautiful to see 3 bumps and the middle spans had gone. When I told the Germans it was only the English, they felt sheepish. They had taken cover. It is good to hear. It's good to laugh at the Boches, for they cannot understand it and they become uncertain. "You will understand," said Madame, "that we longed every moment for the day when the Germans would go. But it is only right to admit there are some who suffer through being born into the wrong race, and races which suffer from having certain wrong individuals," I said. "It is always necessary to be a person and not a part of the herd. After all, one is not a cow to follow a bell without asking who wears it." We plunged happily into a discussion on ethics, punctuated by frequent d'accord to show our mutual agreement. Apropos of the necessity of thinking for oneself, our host said regretfully, "There are certain Frenchmen who have done things of which I do not approve. Not in this town, but not so far away. There were 5 Germans who surrendered after their officers had deserted them. They were very glad to surrender, for they wanted to go home to their families. But my compatriots threw them into the river and used them as targets until they sank." He shook his head in mild rebuke. "Ce n'est pas gentil, ça." Had I been one of the targets, I should have considered it rather more than ill-mannered. It was late. Warmed by the kindliness of our hosts, we went back to the hotel. There had been a vivid demonstration that it is not events, but the attitude towards them which is important. The bedroom was bitterly cold, and with sudden apprehension I wondered why the sheets looked so grey. They were grey, not with diet, but with moisture. "It must be difficult to air laundry with no proper heating," I said, with feigned nonchalance. "We had better sleep in our coats," said Charles. This is the dampest bed I have ever encountered. This is the end of this chapter. The next chapter is coiffure and cuisine.